Michael, if I could address this one to you, specifically actually addressed to you by the questioner. The question is, many have seen the US as the leading party to unlock the negotiations. Copenhagen saw also a shift to the importance of China. What is actually the carrot for China to sign on to any future agreements?
That's interesting. I didn't actually see it in the list of questions on the web addressed to me, but I'll happily pick it up. But I want to actually preface it, if I may, by a comment on the previous discussion, which feeds into the broad theme of how I view the outcome from Copenhagen. Richard gave a fairly robust response to the idea of legally enforceable commitments. And so a couple of the questions that popped up on my web were about the role or the credibility of the EU. I think it's actually very important to get a clear view on this. First, something not only can be, but almost always has been legally binding in international law without trade sanctions or other enforcement measures that have that kind of degree of teeth or direct economic consequence. And yet, as any international legal scholar will tell you, US scholars amongst the foremost, the adherence with international law is pretty much as high as the adherence with domestic law. And the reason for that is internationally legally binding has a very particular significance under the Vienna Law of Treaties that underpins the entire body of every multilateral treaty negotiated since then, over many decades. And a country that signs up, that adopts, signs up, and then ratifies a treaty, and then says, no, we didn't really mean it, is undermining the entire body of international law and their expectation that other countries will stick to what they've promised. So I think the reference to trade sanctions is a complete red herring of a much actually more important debate that was very deep and one of the fundamental ones at Copenhagen. And you'll see why I want to wind it around also to the question about US and China. So let me start illustrating that with just how much it's mattered in practice for, and most notably, the European Union. Its core implementation device on emission reductions is the European Trading Scheme. The European Trading Scheme was contingent upon how many allowances individual member states would give out to their industries, how many emission allowances, and there was an almighty political battle 4 years back, about the fact that many countries have given rather generous, emerging from a nice cuddly bottom-up process of what the individual countries could deliver, given out too many emission allowances to their industries. And it actually took the European Commission, with the legal authority of Europe's needs to comply with the Kyoto Protocol binding caps, was the legal basis upon which those allocations are toughened up by 10%. And now we know that actually they were still too weak. It's still clear that the EU ETS is nothing like as strong really as people had thought or intended at the time. And I think that is an important indication of just how much international law matters and why it was such a big deal. However, I do agree with Richard that it's less of a big deal for China and the US, countries where you have an even more convoluted domestic process, regarding themselves, much bigger individual powers, and frankly, with a much more relaxed attitude, as we've heard from Richard, about just the whole meaning of international law relative to the primacy of domestic processes. But I don't think that means that the rest of the world can or should consider throwing away the whole notion of legally binding constraints, because frankly, I think European experience has proved that it's important and it works. I was at a meeting in Washington 2 weeks ago, and I was kind of sad at the sort of myth that, Europe may not comply with Kyoto. It will. And the reason it will is because it's binding under international law. That toughened up the domestic system. It's provided the basis for countries to fund emission reductions also elsewhere through the offset provision. So there's flexibility combined with legal accountability, which is what the system was designed for. And it's a rolling system along the way that Richard indicated, repeated rounds of negotiations to adapt and improve. So I think the big lesson, the most fundamental lesson I was trying to get at in relation to the global problem is that a few mega powers, perhaps just a couple, US and China, are primarily internal driven, have, if you like, a much more relaxed attitude to international law, much greater scepticism about the value of international law, because so much more hinges upon the domestic pressures that drive them to a certain degree of action, which is not strongly influenced by a global deal. That's not the case for the rest of the world. What is the hook for China to come in? Well, I think there's two things. And I think that's an odd, incidentally, phrase. I think one could also say, what's the hook for the US to come in? Let's not pretend it. You can't force either of those countries into solving climate change if they don't want to solve climate change. So the first requirement is China and the US have to see this as a real, serious, legitimate threat. Second, there has to be a degree of mutuality in their commitments. Now, I emphasize a degree, and this is a very delicate thing, which was at the forefront of the crunch negotiations in Copenhagen. The US had insisted that it could see China as an emerging threat, challenge its superpower status and economic dominance. China had to be on the same legal footing. China was always of the view that the UN convention process always started with the principle that industrialized countries had to demonstrate their leadership. The most consistent course of complaint across the entire developing world has been the failure of the industrialized countries to honor that commitment, of which the prime finger has indeed been pointed at pretty much the world's highest per capita emitter, namely the US. So I think that the mutuality is the US has to demonstrate that it's getting its emissions under control domestically. Otherwise, there is no basis. And when Chinese, and indeed many other people, were asked why did China offer relatively so little, one of the responses, well, what did the US offer at China? What actual carrots was the US able to offer to bring China on board? And the answer at that time was almost nothing, because it hadn't yet completed the domestic process. If the US can come up with stronger domestic action this year, still very contested, then I think we'll see a lot more pressure on China to firm up and, if you like, make harder what is already, in numbers terms, potentially quite a significant offer that they made in the run-up to Copenhagen. And I should finish there. That was a long answer, but I think it covered important ground.
Yes. Could I make a comment on that?
Yeah, could you respond?
I want to respond. I wasn't implying that the United States takes international law or its obligations under international law lightly. It doesn't, and I think its record in that regard is as good as anybody's. But what I was saying was really the opposite side of that question, that when a country like the United States or China or others says without the word mandatory, says this is our plan, this is what we're going to do, and makes a commitment that means a great deal too, and that the difference between the imperative that countries feel once they've put their word on the line and whether it's incorporated in an international law agreement is not that great. But you get a lot when you get countries. It's not a frivolous thing that countries do when they say this is what we are going to do, whether or not it's tied to the word mandatory.
I agree.